Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to be here. I didn't really know what I was letting myself in for. And in fact, it didn't take me very long yesterday evening when I arrived to find that pretty well everybody I spoke to probably knew more about this topic than I do. So that's slightly disconcerting because I spoke to quite a small sample, but I think it was reasonably representative, which as a social scientist is what I look for. So I'm pretty in awe of what I have to do, particularly because I've not really started properly yet. I've arranged as part of my Nuffield 18 months or so to go to a number of countries. I'm particularly keen if anybody here comes to me later and says they know a lot about Canada, and particularly British Columbia, because I'm going there next spring for 6 to 8 weeks. I'm also going to Denmark, I'm going to Netherlands, I'm going to Switzerland, and I'm still thinking about other places. If someone had told me, even probably just 3 or 4 years ago, that I would be standing in front of an audience and I would be talking about food issues, or indeed beginning to think about food issues, I would have been quite surprised. Because my background, and I'm going to say a bit about, I'm going to do this as a bit of a kind of personal sort of odyssey as to where I've come from. That's kind of where I've come from. So this is really modern farming. I'm sure you will appreciate this picture. This actually is a sort of remnant of a farm I spent a lot of my childhood on. But by the 1980s, my uncle had retired, and it was left to sort of moulder away, really. But it was a classic mixed West Devon farm, 150 acres, a bit of everything, very old-fashioned. I put many a bale on that elevator in my youth, and I became fascinated in farming. Someone asked me last night, well, how did you get to these kind of things? I don't know. How do any of us get to the kind of interests we have? But I became fascinated in farming, and I also became fascinated in the rural environment. If you like, I was a real romantic. I liked old-fashioned farming, and I liked the beautiful British countryside. And so it's not surprising then that when I became an academic, I began to move. This thing doesn't seem. What's happening here? I'm pressing the green button and nothing is happening. I began to get interested in environmental issues, and that has dominated my career. My career has been dominated. I mean, I've occasionally done a little foray into food, done a little bit on organic markets, done a little bit on alternative food systems, but on the whole, it's been this sort of stuff. It's been about how to reconcile modern agriculture with environmental concerns, nature conservation. And I now sit on Natural England Board, and I spend a lot of my time. Tom alluded to the interesting opportunities we have now to refashion policy, and I'm spending time on that, thinking about what agri-environmental policy will look like. But I guess my world and many other people's worlds were disrupted quite violently, in a sense. I, as an academic, not that violently, rather it caused me a lot of interest to suddenly see food prices increase, to suddenly get to a situation 2008 when food and food security were on the lips of policymakers and academics and farmers for the first time in this part of the world for a long time. So that kind of disrupted a lot of people's worlds, I think. I mean, it wasn't new to many people. It was, in many parts of the world, this was not a surprise. But I think it was to the rather complacent West. But suddenly there might be food riots in Cairo, not in sub-Saharan Africa, but in relatively prosperous places. And what came out of that, and what I got particularly interested in, was beginning to consider what this might mean for farming. And many of you will see, and I'm not going to spend much time talking about population increases and pressure on resources and alternative land uses and all that sort of stuff. It's all well known. But the UK response to the food security challenge, certainly in research terms, was to find a concept that actually dated back to the 1980s and 1990s and to sub-Saharan Africa, this notion of sustainable intensification, which to many, certainly in my sort of environmental community, is seen as an oxymoron and is seen as an excuse to begin to find other ways of intensifying agriculture, other ways of allowing farmers to get back to business as usual. And when people say that to me, I just remind them of the word sustainability in there. What Defra decided to do in England and Wales was to set up a research platform on looking at this issue, trying to work out what it meant for farmers, what it meant for landscapes, how we might get at this rather elusive notion of sustainable intensification. And I ended up being co-director of that with Stuart Knight of NIAB, leading the landscape scale project, which is now in its final year. And it was all good fun. There's nothing a researcher likes better than when the territory changes a bit, and suddenly my interest in agriculture, which had always been there, but had been kind of subsumed underneath this sort of environmental stuff for long, long periods of time when I was rushing around the country talking about environmental schemes, quite pleased that agriculture was changing, looking at buffer strips and margins and farm woodland and all this sort of thing. But always going back to my boyhood and thinking, actually, I'm a farmer, really. And what about the real farming? And finding a lot of my environmental colleagues and friends just weren't really interested in agriculture, just interested in controlling farmers, making sure they didn't do anything nasty. And that I'd always been a bit uncomfortable with that right the way through. But it's certainly my discomfort then really had an expression in this, because we began to think, right, let's get agriculture working to produce food because that's what people need, to produce incomes because farmers need to live, but to do so in a sustainable way, to do so in an environmentally benign way. And hey, we might even get to a situation where it can be a win-win, where we can actually improve agricultural productivity, agricultural performance, and improve environmental productivity and performance. And I teach students that there is, in terms of fundamental in ecological science, there is a contradiction between agriculture and high biodiversity. Most farmers do not want lots of high biodiversity in their fields. They want a monoculture of sorts. And there is a kind of contradiction at the heart, and I teach students that. But I go on also to explain, but with good performance, with high skill inputs, with all, real smart farming, we can achieve some of what we need environmentally as well as what we need food-wise. Now, what we've been doing, and I'm obviously not going to spend a huge amount of time on this, I'm just going to whistle through some of this, but what we started doing was looking at how this might pan out in terms of farms. So we had these study farms. We went through a long process of trying to work out where we were going to do this, and we have places like Wyke down in the far southwest near where I live, which has got a really wonderful research farm, research platform, fully hydrologically isolated 3 farmlets, so we can absolutely work out what's going in and what's coming off, mainly because they're good clay soils. Some soils you could not hydrologically isolate, of course, but when you've got clay, you can really begin to work out what is happening. And we're trialling 3 different systems of growing grass to feed beef animals and sheep in that area, and ditto around the country, doing different things on different farms, trying to work out also what that means at a landscape scale, what it means to try and involve farmers in that, collaboration being a key word in that. I'm not going to go through the words here, but it's just to give you a flavour. The words I've put in red on these slides that will follow on the 5 main study farm areas are the only words in our sort of bank of slides that suggest the sort of descriptors of the areas that I reckon are something to do with food. Yeah? And I actually, as we went on, as I say, this is very much a kind of personal sort of story that I'm giving here. As I went on through this, I became increasingly uncomfortable with the fact that we weren't really talking very often about what we were producing in terms of quality and in terms of impacts on people in terms of health. Maybe it's just my age. I don't know. I never really thought about food and health much before. I mean, like many people, rather blasé, just go through life, do what one does. As long as there's a good plate of food in front of me, didn't really mind. So whether it was increasing years, I don't know. But as we went on in the sustainable intensification platform, and still are, I kept thinking, but are we only interested in producing commodities in an environmentally friendly way? Is that really what it's all about? And I would go to meetings with lots of colleagues, and hardly ever did anybody say, Well, maybe we should be adjusting the farming system in order to adjust the nutritional quality of what we're producing. Maybe we should be adjusting our farming system to play to the new health agenda, to the new concerns that are being expressed in that world. We had lots and lots of conversations about adjusting farming system to make sure that we were not putting too much nitrate or phosphate into the water supply, or to make sure that we weren't disturbing the soil as much as we had been in the past. A little bit about making sure that we actually had happy animals, a little bit about animal welfare, but not an awful lot about health. And where it does come in, it's kind of about quality. Quality is one of those funny words that can mean anything to anybody. You know, your quality may not be my quality. And if you actually go out, as I did in a research project some years ago, and ask consumers what they mean by quality, you get a lot of things coming in. For some people, it is literally just about food safety. It's about making sure that this stuff is not going to harm me. For other people, it is a lot about taste and that whole sensory aspects of taste. For some people, it embodies a lot of issues around a lot of ethical issues. So quality is about locality, it's about provenance, it's about farm animal welfare, it's about environment. Eating the view was a term that was coined at one stage. And for a few people in that social science research all those years ago, it was also about health. And so quality on its own could not be defined as only about health. So when you see phrases like demonstrate the potential to improve product quality, meat and milk, you have to really dig in there and say, well, what does that actually mean? What quality are you looking for? And I don't think we've done enough of that in SIP. But that's the kind of thing I'm moving to. But in the context of food culture, whatever that is, another word that is very hard to define, then food culture will capture these multiple meanings of quality. And so trying to play to a new food culture is actually quite difficult. I'm going to whip through these. Ecosystem services, I put that one in because it's a kind of around diversity, and you might say an ecosystem service is high quality and nutritious food. Here we have one which didn't seem to mention quality and health at all. I mean, I've seen these slides are available. I'm obviously not got time to go through them in detail. If any of you have an opportunity to go to some of these places, then they are great. Allerton is not very far from here and is a fantastic farm demonstrating really how to try and farm better. They've done a lot of work on cover crops there. They're trying to tackle the black grass issue. It's a major issue which requires more rotation, more cover crops, etc. So really, really interesting. And critical to a lot of this, and if I had time, I'd come back to this over and over again, are the farmers and the farmer networks and the farmer knowledge. I as a researcher, increasingly aware, unless we've got farmers in on this game, we're just wasting our time. I can beaver away with my research and I can have jolly interesting conversations and I can look up lots of data, but unless farmers are engaged and involved, I'm not really giving much benefit. Nafferton, another one. That's an interesting one, actually. Nafferton is one that is, in some ways, is a little bit of an exception to what I've been saying in a rather blasé way. They have got a lot of interest in quality in terms of cereals and trying to cater for the sort of gluten-free and those who have health issues around gluten. So going back and looking at some of the non-wheat cereals, spelt and rice. So there's some interesting. Very, very interesting project going on at Newcastle in that area, which is very relevant, and I want to find out more about it during my research. Okay, so, I suppose the issue that began to sort of really impress itself upon me was this whole sense of a nutrition transition. This book by Barry Popkin, The World is Fat, which I guess might be seen as offensive. We tread on delicate ground here. But this extraordinary shift from a situation where when I was a student in the 1970s, All of my lectures around food, I did an environmental degree at Wyke College, were all, we had whole modules on development and African and Latin American countries, and it was all about the issue of trying to get food to people because they were undernourished. And we've shifted. Now, there is still some of that. Of course, there is a lot of that, and there's a lot of that at the moment in parts of Africa, as we know. But globally, we have shifted towards a situation where overweight is significantly more of an issue in many countries than underweight. Of course, intriguingly and interestingly, in some countries, it's kind of both within the same borders, different segments of the population. So Popkin developed this notion of nutrition transition, in which he basically showed how we'd moved to this high fat, high sugar kind of diet, and the health implications of that. And he envisages a change in that far column. He envisages moving away from the increased fat, sugar, processed foods, and caloric beverages. He's moving back towards a new and better place. Now, whether we do and how we do is not for me today. But so those are the kind of issues that are challenging, this is all familiar territory, I think, now, certainly for most of you. The sense that we are eating the wrong things, the phrase that is often used, particularly around these fizzy drinks and things like that, is empty calories. They get the calories in. The high sugar, they do not get the vitamins, the minerals, the antioxidants, amino acids, fibre. So our diet, and I'm way outside my comfort zone. I'll look to others later to say more about this. But this is the sort of challenging issue, and in the context of less exercise. And Barry Hopkin talks at length about how this has come about and how people have, we haven't adjusted our diet and our desires to take account our changing life. That's just hardly surprising, considering that for 99.9% of human existence, we have not led the sort of sedentary lives that many people lead now. And so I'll whip through these figures. That's the startling data on the patterns of obesity, percentage overweight in different parts of the country. So there is a clear geographical pattern to this. It is broadly associated with higher wealth places, although not. The association is not perfect. Certainly see parts of Latin America you wouldn't perhaps expect to be up there. There are obviously sort of cultural issues in with this, issues to do with food culture. Look at France and Italy, for example, in a better place than the rest of Europe. The famous Mediterranean diet. I mean, these are but not Spain and Portugal. These are interesting issues to sort of try and tease out as to why it's different in different places. India in a better place, arguably, than China. And I think there are some clear cultural issues there, two rapidly emerging economic powerhouses. But of course, India is Hindu culture. That has clearly had an influence on some of that as well. But it is changing there as well. So we have some interesting challenges. In the UK, I'm just going to say a little bit about some of the figures. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but we have an interesting situation. Actually, a lot of the things that we think perhaps we shouldn't eat so much of, maybe, have actually gone down in quantity over the last few years. This is an interesting one, really, to see those subtle changes between 1975 and 2015. But there's masses of stuff hidden away in these data. And so, I mean, if you look at the potato one, fresh and processed potatoes. Well, processed potatoes, of course, mean crisps and things like that. We'll see in a minute, but actual fresh potatoes has gone down quite a lot. Carcass meat down, non-carcass meat and meat products up a little bit. There's a lot of noise in these data, which I haven't really got time to go into. Milk. Here we have which won't surprise people at all. Liquid whole milk, i.e., not skimmed at all. A dramatic reduction. I mean, what this basically shows, to those of you who challenge the fact that things can change and that publicity can, look at that figure. Whole milk came under attack. Many would argue wrongly. I'm not making any assumptions about whether some of this stuff is right in terms of whether we should have done that. But, it came under attack. I remember as a child, my father was the only one who was allowed to have the gold top milk for health reasons. Because my father was not well, and he wasn't well, and he died young for various reasons. But it was considered a good thing that he had the best milk. And that, of course, dramatically changed. I was vaguely aware of it, actually, in my teens, that giving Dad this milk, is that really the right thing? But so you can see, we see with smoking, the data on smoking is often used to show how a major sort of campaign can affect what people do. And there you see it with liquid whole milk. Semi-skimmed, came from absolutely nowhere. You couldn't buy it in the 1970s when I was young, and then it came up. The overall is decline, gentle decline, but significant decline in milk and milk products. This is believe me, this is not all the meat products. These are just some selected ones that I wanted to draw your attention. So, ready meals and convenience meat products, dramatic rise. Dramatic rise. Now, of course, a lot of, that covers lots of things. But it probably, almost certainly, covers things that we shouldn't be eating. There are lots of additions to those food products, whether it be salt, sugar, or whatever. So and fat. So, but that's where it's gone out. Now, some of the things that are particularly, I find intriguing. Liver. I used to like liver. Can't get it now, really, hardly. It's almost gone off the scale. It used to be a sort of pretty, we would have it as a child, certainly every couple of weeks or every 3 or 4 weeks there would be a liver dish. Offal was, something that people went out and bought and cooked. Yeah. And it's gone. It does not really figure in our food culture at all. Now, there are certain chefs, celebrity chefs, as you know, who are trying to sort of capture offal again, find a place for offal. I think rightly so, but it's interesting to see its decline. Mutton and lamb, I think, is a desperately worrying decline. So that this is from 1974 to 2015, and we see the grams per person per week of mutton and lamb going down from about 120 to round about sort of 40. Now, we produce a lot of sheep in this country. I know there are people in this audience who think they produce a lot of sheep, and they do. We also produce quite a lot. You may not see so many around here, but certainly you go to the west and the north, there are a lot of those animals around. They are hugely important in our uplands for maintaining a particular type of grassland ecosystem. We are totally dependent, our sheep market is totally dependent on exports now, and we do not have a clue what is going to happen to that in the context of Brexit. So there is a sector that is, in terms of changing taste, changing demand, I would suggest is probably going to be under the cosh. I mentioned potatoes just now. Again, this is dramatic. Processed potatoes up with all those additions of fat and salt and various things, and fresh potatoes very significantly down. Again, changing diets. Now, is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I'm not going to get into that, but these are the sorts of trends that are there. Now, I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes very quickly on some of the analysis around this. And the first one here, in the United Kingdom, obesity, the second largest impact in the health sector, talking economically after smoking, an economic loss of more than 70 billion, 3% of GDP. That is bigger than agriculture's contribution to GDP in this country. So these are kind of stark data. We absolutely have to tackle the obesity challenge. Now, this particular report by consultants went through a list of possible interventions. And I want to cheer you farmers up a little bit by saying that agriculture does not feature very often in this list. There are many, many other things of dealing with this. It isn't just about agriculture at all. Active transport, the healthcare payers, health insurance premiums, it's less relevant to this country, but certainly around the world, free gym membership, all sorts of things to encourage people, to nudge people, to help people to live more healthily. Healthy meals, reducing high-calorie food and drink availability, looking at vending machines in schools and workplaces, fast food retailers from locations outside schools. We're making sort of slow progress in that direction. You know, there's been quite a lot of work around school meals in this country, better labelling, restrictions on advertising. That'll be an interesting one. You remember the furore, those of you who are old enough, the furore over the beginning of the restrictions on advertising for tobacco products a few decades ago. Go down that with food, and of course much more complicated with food. Parental education, pharmaceuticals, drugs to reverse obesity rapidly. Surgery, of course, can come into that as well. Portion control, price promotion, public health campaigns, reformulation of food products, school curriculum. These are all the sorts of things you would expect to be there. And finally, we get to agriculture. Subsidies, taxes and prices, changing agricultural policy or regulatory policy to adjust consumer prices and supply of select food and beverage categories. But doesn't actually say anything there about much about farm commodities as such, just sort of nudging through policy. Urban environment, change of encouraging people to be more physical, weight management programs, workplace wellness. Right. So I just said it doesn't say an awful lot about actual content of agricultural products, and I think we've got to begin to move in that direction. So these, as I say, these are very, very initial thoughts. I do feel rather fraudulent standing here, especially as the first speaker today, because I ain't got much to say yet. I managed to fill up 25 minutes, but you'll probably think, well, I'm just setting the agenda in a sense, as much for myself as anybody else. So renewed emphasis on nutritional quality in agricultural R&D. Yeah, that comes from my experience of sustainable intensification. We've got to begin to do that. I looked at the Newcastle work that I mentioned on cereals as a shining example of where that is beginning to happen, but there's a lot more needed. Working much more closely with the health sector. That is beginning to happen with some research projects. It's long overdue. It's a sadness to me, and I was speaking only yesterday in Defra, that Defra didn't get Public Health England or Department of Health on side on that work, or we'd have had a very different project, I think. Working more closely with opinion leaders, from TV chefs to environmentalists, to build a new food culture. And the whole issue of direct retail, where, I think direct retail has been absolutely fantastic in this country. It's been fantastic in various countries around the world. Farmers reconnecting with their consumers, saying more about their food. But it's only ever touched a small proportion. And that is the big, big challenge. It's only ever got to a small segment of consumers. And I kind of, having been watching that scene for 20 odd years, I kind of struggle to see it going much further than that. Okay, so in a year's time, I think it's going to be in July 2018, I might have a little bit more illuminating things to say on this subject, because by then I will have gone to University of British Columbia Centre for Sustainable Food Systems, met interesting people in Canada, met interesting people in Denmark, got a list of farms in Denmark that I was sent by a contact yesterday that I ought to visit, and so on and so forth. And I will talk about that in July, and I will try and work out how UK agriculture, UK farmer can respond to these changes, can play his or her part without in any way assuming it's only their agenda. I don't want agriculture to feel beaten over the head by this, as they've been beaten over the head on animal welfare, animal diseases, environmental issues in the past. I want this to be a great opportunity. I want this to be something whereby agriculture and farmers can respond to consumer demands, consumer concerns, and really benefit the industry from that. I do think we have a great opportunity to do that. And I think with 31 seconds left on the clock, I'm done.